Hello, welcome to week 2 of our course. First, I want to thank you all for participating in week 1. The discussion board related to Native American history was very interesting and engaging. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your research on the topic. During week 2 of the course, we will be focusing on various aspects of life in colonial America. Colonial America, in terms of what later becomes the United States, is generally referring to the period from 1607, when the colony of Jamestown was founded in Virginia, up until 1776 and the beginning of the American Revolution. Specifically in this unit, we are going to be exploring or focusing upon the Salem witch trials and the transatlantic slave trade. You do have a few assignments to complete during week 2 of the course. One assignment is to read chapters 4 and 5 from Boundless, your e-text. A second assignment is to participate in a discussion board related to the Salem witch trials. And a third assignment is to complete a blog post related to the transatlantic slave trade. The Salem witch trials took place in colonial New England, and colonial New England had a distinct and unique culture amongst the colonies of British North America. One of the interesting things about the British North American colonies is that they were quite unique and different. Colonial Georgia was very different from colonial Virginia, and colonial Massachusetts was very different from both colonial Virginia and colonial Georgia. So each of the areas of the colonies had a distinctive culture. So to understand the Salem witch trials, we need to understand a little bit about life in colonial New England. The majority of the white settlers, European settlers, who came to colonial New England were Puritans, members of the Puritan faith. A bit about this. The Puritans were a persecuted religious minority group in England. They were individuals who wanted to change or reform the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church, which is also called the Church of England, was the dominant church in England. It was the official Church of England. The King of England was officially the head of the Anglican Church. And certainly in the 17th century, all people in England were expected to recognize the Anglican Church and support the Anglican Church. The Puritans did not. In that sense, they were religious rebels. The Puritans believed that the Anglican Church was corrupt, that it was too similar to the Catholic Church, and they wanted to institute a variety of reforms to change the practice of Christianity. Hence their name. The name Puritan, the root word is to purify. They believed that the Anglican Church was contaminated by Catholic rituals and traditions, and they wanted to purify the church to create a new kind of Christianity. So, due to persecution, Puritans sought to leave England. Not all, but many. At first, Puritans traveled to Holland, and they actually established a settlement in an area called Scooby Manor in Holland. But they found that life in Holland was not to their liking. Their children started to assimilate into Dutch culture, and Dutch culture was very secular. You could practice any religion that you wanted to in Holland, essentially. It was the most religiously free state in Europe in that sense. But the Puritans really didn't want to lead a secular lifestyle. They wanted to lead a devoutly religious lifestyle, and they found that living in secular Holland, their children actually were integrating into that more secular culture. Hence, many Puritans, many of whom had already settled in Holland, some of whom were still in England, decided to venture to the Americas, to start a new life in the Americas. And the Puritans received charters from the monarchy of England, from the King of England, to establish settlements in colonial North America. They actually were originally supposed to travel to colonial Virginia, but went off course and ended up settling first in Plymouth and then colonial Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans why did the king grant the Puritans a charter? You have to remember that the monarchy was very hostile to the Puritans. They viewed the Puritans essentially as traitors or rebels. And part of granting this charter for the Puritans to travel to the Americas was essentially to get rid of them. The king saw this as potentially beneficial to be rid of some of the Puritans, so that they wouldn't be in England anymore. So the Puritans were a devoutly religious group. They traveled in family units to the Americas, to Plymouth, and then to Massachusetts Bay and beyond, primarily in colonial New England. They were Calvinists, essentially. To be a Calvinist meant they supported the teachings of John Calvin. John Calvin's principal teaching was called the doctrine of predestination. The Puritans believed that their souls were destined to go to either heaven or hell, and that there was nothing that they could possibly do to change their fate. So the Puritans believed that even before they were conceived, that God had already determined whether their soul would go to heaven or hell, and nothing that they did in this life could possibly change that. The Puritans were always looking for signs as to whether they were among the elect who would go to heaven or the damned who would go to hell. They believed that some were destined to go to heaven and others were destined to go to hell. So there was a great anxiety in being a Puritan. Anything could be taken as a sign that you're either going to heaven or going to hell. So if you engaged in a sinful act, perhaps that was a sign that you were among the damned. If you were prosperous and successful, maybe that was a sign that you were among the elect, but you could never really be sure. So the Puritans establish essentially agricultural communities in colonial New England, and certainly over time you see the emergence of commercial urban centers like Boston and other smaller locales as well. And faith was very much at the center of their lives. Every township would have a town hall in the middle of the village, and this would serve as both the center of government and the center of faith. The Puritans had no concept of a separation of church and state. That's a concept that didn't exist yet. For them, the church and the state were inextricably linked to one another. To vote in colonial New England, you had to be a member of the Puritan Church. Those who were not members of the Puritan Church could not vote. One could be punished for not attending religious services by being put in the stocks. So it didn't meet our concept of what religious freedom is. It was very much a Puritan community, essentially. Roman Catholics were not allowed to live in colonial New England by law. Non-Christians were not allowed to live in colonial New England by law. The Puritans also very much believed that Satan or the devil was a real presence in the world. The Puritans believed that Satan walked the earth to tempt human beings. That just as God, in their belief, was a powerful force in the world, that Satan was also very real and a very powerful force in the world. So the Puritans did believe in witchcraft. The Puritans believed that Satan would tempt people to join him, and that the people who joined Satan, who essentially signed contracts with Satan, would become witches or warlocks. For females, the term was witch. For males, the term was warlock. The Puritans generally believed that women were more susceptible for coming under the sway of Satan than men, so they believed that witches were more common than warlocks, though they did believe that both existed. There were witchcraft trials in Europe if you go back to the 15th and 16th centuries, so there certainly was a precedent for what took place with the Salem witch trials. With the Salem witch trials, it really started in a household that employed a slave from the Caribbean named Tituba. There were slaves in colonial New England. There's a misconception, I think, that slavery only existed in the South. Slavery was certainly more common in the American South, where you had plantation agriculture, but there were African American slaves in colonial New England as well, many of whom performed domestic labor, as was the case with Tituba. Um, a group of girls to young women um, took to listening to stories told by Tituba, and Tituba's told folk stories from her own background in the Caribbean. Um, and she entertained the girls with stories of practices like cracking an egg and putting an egg into a suspension of fluid, and supposedly one could see the face of their future husband in the egg white in the solution. All sorts of sort of stories and rituals from her own tradition and background. Um, the aspects of voodoo tradition were shared with the girls, and soon the girls began to act strangely and begin to assert that they had been bewitched, that witches were tormenting them. One of the people that they pointed the finger at was Tituba. Of course, Tituba was very vulnerable as a slave. She had very low status in colonial New England. There was no one really to come to her defense, and hence she was certainly an easy person to accuse. Um, Certainly, she didn't have a lot of social support that would stand behind her. So you begin to see a frenzy of paranoia about witchcraft, that there are witches active in colonial New England. The girls are asked to identify who has been tormenting them, who has visited them as witches. And they begin to name names, not just Tituba, but other women in the community. At first, the women involved start to identify generally women who were on the margins of society, women who were poor, who were widowed, who didn't have anyone to support them, defend them, who were considered to be of low social status. And then the frenzy of the witchcraft hysteria begins to take hold. You have trials that take place. The girls who claim that they are being tormented by witches give testimony about being visited by ghosts and specters, about the witches sending visions to them and tormenting them. The girls in the courtroom go into fits and scream, and they claim that the people who are accused of witchcraft are tormenting them, but only they can see it. This was called spectral evidence. There was tremendous pressure on the accused to admit that they were witches. There were a few things that could possibly happen with a witchcraft trial. One is the individual accused of being a witch could confess. If they confessed, they would live. If they didn't confess and were found guilty, they would be put to death. So there's a tremendous incentive to basically acknowledge that you are a witch. And once you confess that you're a witch, you were expected to identify other people that were witches. So it starts a sort of cascading effect. One person is accused of witchcraft, they confess to avoid death, but they have to name names of others who are witches. And so you begin this witchcraft paranoia and scare begins to spread from there. And more women are accused of being witches. Some interesting phenomena begin to develop. A lot of widowed women were accused of being witches, and a lot of widowed women who held property were accused of being witches, which I think is interesting. It was almost impossible for women in colonial America to own property. Any property a woman held was legally the property of either her father or her husband or her eldest son. So if a woman was not married, her property was her father's. If a woman was married, her property was legally her husband's. If a woman was widowed and had a son, her property legally belonged to her son. The only way a woman could legally own property was if she was widowed and had no son. So you do see a lot of women who have property being accused and then their property being seized from them. So some have argued there may have been a gendered narrative to the witchcraft trials. Perhaps women who had some property were being accused because, perhaps either consciously or subconsciously, there's the belief that there's something wrong with them in the order of things, that it was not proper for women to have property, to be independent. There were a few men accused of being warlocks, one of whom was a minister. One minister was executed for being a warlock. He was hung by the neck until dead. Prior to being hung, he recited the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, word for word perfectly, because a witch or warlock was not supposed to be able to say the prayer correctly. So he wanted to make that point. Perhaps it stirred some to think about the issue. Another man who was accused refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. Under English law, the defendant had to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty before a trial could commence. So this man decided he simply would never enter a plea, and hence he could never formally be formally tried for witchcraft. When you refuse to enter a plea, they put you through a trial known as pressing. So they took this man and they laid him on a wooden board, and then they put another wooden board over his chest, and they piled heavy stones on top of him. So they put heavy stones on top of him and say, "Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" And he would say nothing. And they pile some more heavy stones on top of the board. And they said, "Are you guilty or not guilty?" He said nothing. As the weight built up, finally the last thing he said was more weight. They put a few more stones on. His chest literally broke and collapsed under the weight, and he died. But he was not found guilty of being a witch, and I think that was the point. He didn't want to be found guilty of witchcraft, and he perceived that this was actually the only way that he could avoid that. If he had gone to trial, he would have either had to confess that he was a witch, or he would have been found guilty. Of being a warlock, I should say. It was only after the governor's wife was accused of being a witch that finally state authorities intervened and put an end to the witchcraft trials. As more and more prominent women were accused, there was a backlash against the witchcraft trials. You'll also be discussing the transatlantic slave trade in your blog post. The transatlantic slave trade begins in the 15th century. The Portuguese are the first to begin to explore the coast of West Africa. They're actually sailing around the coast of West Africa in search for a trade route to China, the same reason that Columbus sailed west into the Atlantic, or at least one of the reasons that Columbus sailed west into the Atlantic. But as the Portuguese sail along the coast of West Africa, of course, they come into contact with West African peoples of various cultures and traditions, and they begin to engage in trade with the peoples of West Africa. They discover that merchants in West Africa have access to valuable goods like gold, ivory, and ultimately, tragically, human beings. The slave trade really gains momentum after the European settlement of the Americas takes place. Once the Europeans begin to establish colonies in the Americas in the late 15th, early 16th century, there's a tremendous demand for labor. Laborers are needed for the European colonies to work in the mines and in agriculture, to harvest sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, rice, and a variety of other valuable products. Native Americans proved not to be a reliable labor source for the Europeans. The Europeans certainly did try to enslave the Native Americans, but since the Native Americans had never been exposed to European disease culture, Native Americans died in huge numbers after contact with Europeans. So the Native Americans could not serve as a large labor force in the New World. Hence, Europeans look to both white indentured servants and to African slaves, both non-free forms of labor. Slavery, of course, was the most abusive of all of the labor systems, because people were taken against their will and sold into bondage. It's estimated that between the 15th century and the 19th century, approximately 20 million people were taken into slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, and that approximately half of these persons, approximately 10 million, survived the voyage to the Americas. We don't have exact figures, we probably never will, but I do think that this is a reasonably good estimate based on the records that we have. How did the transatlantic slave trade work? Europeans, first the Portuguese, later the Spanish, the English, the French, the Dutch, really many European countries were involved. Europeans' ships and merchants would come to the coast of West Africa, and with the permission of West African kingdoms, they established trading outposts, trading houses along the coast of West Africa. Many of the West African kingdoms wanted to profit by engaging in trade with Europeans as well. They were desirous of European trade goods, most prominently weapons. The Europeans had firearms and steel weapons and armor that merchants in West African kingdoms were very desirous of. And so a trade develops, a terrible trade, where Europeans export weapons, rum, clothing, and a variety of other goods, and bring those into West African ports. And Europeans offer to exchange these weapons, alcohol, trade goods, in exchange for people, for slaves. Europeans at this point are not venturing deep into the interior of Africa. Rather, they're relying upon African merchants to bring slaves to them. So the process essentially is West African merchants go into the interior of Africa. They often go with essentially armies, with armed men. They go into the interior of Africa, attack villages, and seize human beings as slaves. Under armed guard, these captives, these slaves, are marched and brought by boat along rivers from the interior of West Africa to the coast of West Africa by African merchants. And then these African merchants sell these human beings to European merchants in exchange for weapons and various other supplies. Then the slaves are held captive in European trading outposts for a period of days, weeks, or months until a slave ship arrives. They're forcibly put on board the slave ships, typically branded on the chest, and forced below decks and put in chains, and then transported across the Atlantic Ocean on a voyage that could take 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, depending on the weather, and brought to the Americas to be sold to plantation owners primarily to work to forcibly work in agriculture, essentially. The whole ordeal was tremendously horrific and deadly. Many of those taken prisoner died before they even reached the coast of West Africa. Many more died on board the slave ships due to the harsh conditions and disease. They were treated often quite brutally. Some tried to revolt and to take over the slave ships. Some even jumped into the Atlantic Ocean to commit suicide. So horrific was their fate. They considered death to be better than what they were currently enduring. And approximately half died en route to the Americas. So you'll be reading some narratives about the transatlantic slave trade. One of the more interesting narratives about the transatlantic slave trade is a narrative written by a slave named Olaudah Equiano. Olaudah Equiano was taken as a boy from West Africa into slavery, was transported to the coast, sold to Europeans, transported to the Caribbean. Fortunately, he did survive and was able to gain his freedom, and he later wrote an account of his experience as a slave. So you're asked to write a blog post related to the transatlantic slave trade. So I look forward to working with you all during this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.